Good morning.
Good morning.
There we are. I want to thank Elder Peterson for giving me a few moments this morning to share with you something that is near and dear to my heart. I think you've been passed one of these. It says Adventist Heritage Ministry, a past with a future. You should have also received one of these, our bulletin. And what is Adventist Heritage Ministry? What is it? Well, Adventist Heritage Ministry is not a privately owned or independent ministry. It is part of the Ellen G. White estate. It is owned and operated by the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists, and it has its offices divided between the General Conference building in Silver Spring, Maryland, and Madison, Michigan, where we carry on some activities. We say, as the front of your brochure does, that we have a past with a future. And of course, the future is always more important than the past. Why do we come here on a Saturday morning? Is it because we need a place to go and it's Sabbath? Is it because our children are in the church school, so we need to come to church with them? Is it because our children enjoy the Pathfinder Club? Is it we come here to hear Elder Peterson preach to us? Do we come here to just meet friends and have some social time? Do we come here to participate in the musical program? Well, perhaps it's all of the above, and even more things to add to that list. But I would like to suggest this morning, most of all the things we can think about as to why we're here. We are here this morning because we believe Jesus is coming again. Amen. And it is that thought, that idea, that moved our pioneers to bring us to what we call the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and our reason for being here this morning. But it's really for a lot of reasons, but mostly and firstly, our belief that Jesus is coming again. I was born in a Seventh-day Adventist home. It scares me to think that that's just about 73 years ago. My grandmother was a Seventh-day Adventist. My mother was a Seventh-day Adventist. She converted my father when I was about 4 years of age, so I really don't remember when he wasn't a Seventh-day Adventist. And from the time I can remember, either grandmother, mother, church school teachers, Sabbath school teachers, academy teachers, college teachers were telling me Jesus is coming again. I remember in 1955 when the Russians sent a little Sputnik up into the air, and some of you may be old enough to remember that. And it was going beep, beep, beep and sailing around in space. Elder HMS Richards came to campus and gave us a week of prayer. And he said, some of you will never get married. Jesus is coming that soon. He's coming that soon. And the time is gone. And I've had children and grandchildren who are getting to be just about as old as I am. But we believe that Jesus is coming again. Amen. We have been told many times that we have nothing to fear for the future, except we forget how God has led us in the past. But is it possible? Is it possible that we could forget? Throughout the recorded history of mankind, remembering God's leading in our past has always been extremely important. Because the lessons from the Old Testament and some from the New tell us that when we forget, we tend to wander away and forget God. And it is that reality that moved several Adventist laymen in 1981 to gather up and rebuild in Battle Creek the remains of Ellen White's home and restore it to its original condition when she lived there. And the beginning of Adventist Heritage Ministry started at that time. The story of God's leading in the history of the Adventist Church was too important to be lost. So, through the acquiring and opening of some of these historical Adventist sites, and put that together with the exciting stories of the pioneers, of their commitment, their worship, their sacrifice, the way they lived and worked, we have an inspiring experience for those who visit Adventist heritage properties to learn something, to renew their faith as we look to the future. Since the founding of Adventist Heritage Ministry, historic Adventist properties have opened a 3-block area in the city of Battle Creek that contains some 16 or 18 buildings where our pioneers started the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Since its founding, they have taken on the William Miller home, the Hiram Edson farm, recently the Joseph Bates house, and as your brochures show you, many other places around the world, including Ellen White's home in Australia and her home in St. Helena, California, and the first church in Europe and other places in different countries around the world. Adventist Heritage Mission has a mission to remind us of our roots, of where we came from, and why we are here. Because we believe Jesus is coming again. Since 1981, more than 125,000 people have visited the historical sites in North America. And every year, more and more come. The crown jewel of the historical sites in Battle Creek is the home of Ellen White. Ellen and James White lived in this house as they worked in Battle Creek. And it has been restored just as it was when they lived there. It was in this home that Ellen White wrote The Great Controversy. It was in this home that Ellen White put forth the ideas of Adventist education, of our publishing work and our printing, and the medical work for the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which has grown into hospitals and institutions around the world. I will give you just a brief glance at some of the things in Battle Creek. This is a building just behind Ellen White's home called the Second Meeting House. It's called the Second Meeting House because the first meeting house burned down. So they built another one like it, and it fell into disrepair, and I would have to say that this is really the third meeting house because we rebuilt the second one into its original condition again. But church is held here. People come and use this building on Sabbaths, probably half the Sabbaths of the year. There's a service going on in the Second Meeting House at Battle Creek. Another view of the second meeting house. We have just this past 2 months completed the building of the original Review and Herald publishing house. This is what our first Adventist publishing house looked like. Doesn't even have the sign on it yet. The building is an empty shell, but the construction was just finished a few weeks ago, and you can still see around the area it looks like a construction site. This is a home across the street from Ellen White that was occupied by the James Hardy family. He was a stalwart pioneer in the Battle Creek community. This log cabin in Battle Creek represents a very important and interesting story. Although this is not the original home of David Hewitt, David Hewitt lived in a log cabin just like this. It was in this log cabin that Joseph Bates, who had learned and accepted the seventh-day Sabbath while he was on his voyages around the world as a sea captain, came home, retired, and became an itinerant preacher. He knew there was a group of people in Battle Creek who were left over from the great disappointment of William Miller in 1844. And Joseph Bates, with his Sabbath message, decided to go to Battle Creek. He didn't know anyone in town. He went to the post office, and he asked the postmaster, "Who is the most honest man in town?" And the postmaster said, "David Hewitt, who lives in the little log cabin. If he owes you 2 cents, he will walk 10 miles to give it back to you." So Joseph Bates went, knocked on the door of David Hewitt, not knowing him at all, and said, "I am sent from the Lord. I have an important message for you." And Joseph Bates spent that night studying with David Hewitt. And David Hewitt became the first Seventh-day believer in the city of Battle Creek, or the little village of Battle Creek as it was at that time. Of course, at that time, there was no Seventh-day Adventist church. Just a group of leftover Millerites and some others who worshiped on Sunday. And David Hewitt was instrumental in bringing many people in Battle Creek, including the whites, into the belief of the seventh-day Sabbath. Joseph Bates brought us the belief in the seventh-day Sabbath. Well, I'll take you now to the home of William Miller. William Miller's home is over in Whitehall, New York, a few miles from Rutland, Vermont, and is called the birthplace of Adventism in America, because it is from William Miller's belief in the second coming that those people still hung on to that belief. They didn't give it up in 1844. But William Miller is an interesting person. The son of an American patriot. He was a tax collector. He was a sheriff. He was a justice of the peace. He was a soldier. He was a farmer. Most of all, he was a licensed Baptist preacher. And he became convinced that the world would come to an end in October 1843. He later revised that to October 22, 1844. And William Miller lived in this house. He farmed in this barn. And on October 22, 1844, he and a group of people gathered on what we call Ascension Rock, right out behind the barn on the William Miller farm that you just saw. Many of those people had sold their property. They had given everything away. And they stood out there all day waiting for the Lord to come. The Great Disappointment, as it is called. October 22. October 22 was last Thursday, the anniversary of that date. But with that strong belief in the second coming, And Joseph Bates over in Fairhaven, Massachusetts, believing in the seventh-day Sabbath, things came together to the formation of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. It didn't happen overnight. It took quite a few years. A few months after October 22, 1844, William Miller was disfellowshipped from his Baptist church for preaching false doctrine. He preached the world would end, and it didn't happen. And of course, not only was there a great disappointment, there was many people who were very unhappy with William Miller. But he was not alone. There was thousands of people who believed the world was going to end on October 22. There was more than 100 preachers across America who were preaching the world would end on October 22, 1844. We only attach ourselves to William Miller because it's from his group of followers that developed into the Seventh-day Adventist Church. But let me share with you a little bit. William Miller built this chapel right there on his property. It's just a few hundred feet from the house you saw a few minutes ago. And there he preached the second coming and held to his belief that he had made a mistake in timing, in looking at prophecy, but knew that Jesus was coming again. And he held that belief firm and solid to the end of his life. And he's buried just down the road. He and his wife are buried in a little cemetery just down the road about a mile from this Miller Chapel, as we call it. The Miller Chapel is owned by the Advent Christian denomination. They have quite a nice church down here on Highway 42. You go by it when you travel there, and I think there's some other churches in the area as well. The Advent Christians are the leftover remnant of William Miller. And they have formulated a denomination. They own this chapel. We share the upkeep of that chapel with them. We own the farm and the barns and the house. They own the chapel, and we work together. They come each year and have a camp meeting here, and are very nice people to associate with and work with, and we like them. Well, I'll take you from the William Miller home, just down the road a mile, to what we call the boyhood home of William Miller. William Miller was born and raised at this house. When we took it over, it was crumbling into what was left of its basement. So there's not much left of the original boyhood home of William Miller, except many of the big hand-hewn internal beams that hold that house up. The rest of it has been reconstructed and redeveloped. And the caretakers for the William Miller property live in that house and take care of the property and the farm and keep the lawns mowed and things neat and tidy. And we are currently looking for people to come and move into this house and take care of the William Miller farm, because the Everhards, who have been there for the last 7 years, are retiring and are moving to Battle Creek and going into retirement full time. So the boyhood home of William Miller. Beautiful place, nicely kept, nicely put together. I take you now over to Port Gibson, New York, not too far from the city of Rochester, what we call the Hiram Edson Farm. The Hiram Edson Farm is just this house, a reconstructed replica of a house from 1850. And it's a story of a humble farmer turned preacher who reminds us that God uses ordinary people to do some very extraordinary things. But Hiram Edson was a devout disciple of William Miller and believed with all his heart that Jesus was coming again on October 22, 1844. His disappointment, as he writes about it, was a horrible experience. He wept for days. It shook his faith to the very core of his being. But in the months and years that followed, Hiram Edson, with Joseph Bates, and some others who they studied with, constructed the doctrines of the Sabbath, the sanctuary, the state of the dead, the second coming, the spirit of prophecy, as we believe them today. And these men put together these doctrines, which were accepted and became the basis of the Adventist theology at that time. So we refer to the the Hiram Edson home and barn and the farm there where Edson lived. This barn was purchased from his relatives 3 miles down the road, taken apart, moved to this site, reconstructed beside the house. So we have the birthplace of Adventist theology. We have William Miller and his staunch belief in the second coming. Even though his timing was off, he still held on. Jesus is coming again. And Joseph Bates with the Seventh-day Sabbath. Out behind the Hiram Edson barn, this past summer was constructed a prophecy trail. On this trail that goes about a half a mile back into the woods, and you can see that it's just newly constructed from the ground there that hasn't been planted yet. There are 12 signs like this. 12 signs depicting the prophecies from Genesis to Revelation. Where in Genesis we have the promise of the Savior, and in Revelation we have the prophecy of the second coming and the New Jerusalem. So these 12 signs are there through that trail. A little garden is being prepared and planted around each one. And we have the prophecy trail at the Edson farm and barn. The Edson barn is a pleasant place to gather. Churches come for potlucks on Saturdays. Students come and hold meetings there in the barn. A couple of times a year, Andrews University has their theology majors come up and have a Sabbath weekend at this property. So Adventist history plays a big role in helping us remember. Well, I take you to the home of Joseph Bates, Fairhaven, Massachusetts. Joseph Bates is an interesting and colorful life. It's the life of a sea captain. 15 years of age, his father allowed him to go on board a vessel and take a trip to Europe. It's something he wanted to do. And he never gave up his life on the sea till he was 40 years of age. He became a sea captain, owning his own vessels. He was a Millerite Adventist preacher. He was a social reformer and a co-founder of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. When he was finishing his life as a sea captain, he was one of the first captains to sail what he called a temperance voyage. He sailed ships in which no alcohol or tobacco were allowed. And our ideas of health reform, of temperance, of abstinence of alcohol and tobacco can be traced back to the beliefs of Joseph Bates. He believed with all his heart that Christ would return. When he gave up his life as a sea captain, came walking down the dock, and someone said to him, "Captain Bates, what's the good news?" And he says, "The good news is the seventh day is Sabbath, and we better keep it." He became an itinerant preacher, traveling largely at his own expense. When he retired, he was considered a fairly wealthy man in his day with an accumulation of about $30-some thousand. But he spent it preaching the gospel, preaching the seventh-day Sabbath and the second coming. joined in with William Miller and others as an itinerant preacher. Actually, we call him our first foreign missionary because he went to Canada from Fairhaven, Massachusetts, and preached his gospel in Canada. He was a formative leader in organizing the denomination in 1863. And very interesting individual in terms of his life. He tells a story in his book, Joseph Bates. The story is here, how as he was traveling, he got himself into some trouble for taking the wrong cargo to the wrong place during the Spanish-American War. Ended up spending 5 years in a British prison. It was during his time in prison that he studied the Bible and came to the belief of the seventh-day Sabbath. So, very interesting life. You need to read the book on Joseph Bates. But let me just say that Adventist Heritage Ministry has books, tapes, videos. These have all been professionally produced. Hiram Edson, William Miller, Battle Creek, many things. If you go online to the website, you'll find all kinds of interesting things on Adventist history. We are reconstructing. Let me just say a little more about this house. The time we got the Joseph Bates house, it looked like this. It had been added onto several times. The house was built in 1742. It's the oldest continuously occupied home in the city of Fairhaven, Massachusetts. And we've owned it for 8 years, and it's been unoccupied for that time because we're trying to rebuild it as it was in the time of Joseph Bates. This picture and this picture were taken about 2 months ago, and more work has been done, and I don't have the most recent picture of the site. Is it possible that we could forget? Is it possible? The Old Testament is filled with stories of God's people who forgot. I want to share with you a recent story that stresses my point. A few years ago, Elder Jim Nix, who is chairman of the board of Adventist Heritage Ministry and head of the E.G. White Estate, took a group of church school students, 8th graders, on their spring trip. They wanted to take a trip of history of Adventism, which is a great thing for school kids to do. They learn a lot, they're convicted of a lot, and they come back energized and believing more and stronger in the beliefs that we hold. So Jim Nix took these students on this tour of Adventist history sites, and they visited the Edson Farm and the Miller Farm and Ellen White's house and the things in Battle Creek. And they ended their tour on a Saturday evening on Ascension Rock, where he told them the story of the Great Disappointment and all that people had given up, all they had sacrificed for their belief in the second coming. And as he closed that Saturday night worship, he asked the students to stand and hold hands in a circle and sing, "Lift up the trumpet, loud let it ring, Jesus is coming again." And those students looked at him and they said, "Elder Nix, we don't know that song." And he said, "Well, I understand that." He said, "That's a song from my generation." And Elder Nix is just a little bit younger than me. But he said, "That's a song from my generation. Teach me one of your songs of Jesus coming again." And those students talked about this song and this chorus and that chorus. And they finally looked at Elder Nix and they said, "Elder Nix, we don't have a song about Jesus' coming again. And I ask you, is it possible that we could forget? Let us stand and sing. Lift up the trumpet, loud and pray. Jesus is coming again.
Lift up the trumpet and loud let it ring. Jesus is coming again. Cheer up, ye pilgrims, be joyful and sing. Jesus is coming again. Coming again. Coming again. Jesus is coming again. Echo the hilltops. Echo the hilltops. Proclaim its praise. Jesus is coming again. Coming in glory, the Lamb that was slain. Jesus is coming again. Coming again. Coming again. Jesus is coming again. We know this next verse is true. He leaves the world till the last one belongs. Jesus is coming again. Tempest and whirlwinds, the anthem prolong. Jesus is coming again. Coming again. Coming again. Jesus is coming again. Nations are angry by this we know. Jesus is coming again. Knowledge increases, men run to and fro. Jesus is coming again. Coming again. Coming again. Jesus is coming again.
Let us pray. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for the lives, for the witness, for the work, for the sacrifice of the pioneers who started this church we know as the Seventh-day Adventists. We thank you for our beliefs, for our Sabbath, but most of all, Lord, we thank you for the good news. Jesus is coming again. Amen. Help us to be ready to meet that day, we pray in your name. Amen.